I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, Naturopathic Doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I'm joined today by one of my colleagues and friends, Dr. Katrina Allison, and we're going to talk all things energy deficit, and I'll explain a little bit more clearly what we mean about that and how it can impact your menstrual cycle and ovulatory function. So the medical term for this is hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is sort of the scientific way of discussing when your brain essentially decides that your body doesn't actually have the resources available to ovulate and have a regular period. And if you're an athlete, if you identify as an athlete, or if you identify as someone who exercises on a regular basis, or as someone who maybe has delved in to some low calorie dieting or is under fueling on a regular basis, this is an important conversation for you to listen to, even if at this particular moment your period is completely normal. We're going to talk about some of the signs to watch out for that your nutrition and fueling is influencing your menstrual cycle, and give you some strategies for how to approach healthcare and your healthcare provider about this particular topic, because there's some consequences of ignoring an irregular menstrual cycle that's come from either exercising or under nutrition. So first of all, welcome to the show, Katrina.
Thanks so much for having me, Jordan.
So I often will start a podcast episode by having a guest sort of share how this became their passion project, right? It's rare. It's not like we spin the globe and put our finger down and say, I want to specialize in hypothalamic amenorrhea. Everybody has a bit of a story for why they're so passionate about, their area of expertise. I would love if you could share with our audience a little bit about who you are, how you got to this place in your career, and why this is something that you are so interested in discussing.
Yeah. So as we see with lots of healthcare providers, it's definitely a story of my mess became my message. So I am a competitive long distance runner, and I have been ever since high school. And I went through many, many years of my competitive journey without a menstrual cycle. And as we'll talk about, that's, relatively common in high level athletes. But as I came to learn through my own experience, it's not something that is without health consequences. And so it was really through my journey as a competitive athlete, and then later going to naturopathic medical school, where I really realized how important the hormonal system is and the impact that not having a menstrual cycle for many years would have on me for my hormonal health, my bone health, etc., for years to come. And so it's through really my own journey of getting my period back and learning about how to fuel myself as an endurance athlete that has made me really passionate about helping other women with this challenge.
Yeah, I love when people have that sort of personal level of connection with the topic. It makes it very relatable, right? So as a listener, if you're reflecting on, someone's journey and someone's story, it's easy to see yourself in what they're saying and maybe feel a bit more connected. But what about for people that are not, don't identify as a competitive athlete? I want them to feel connected to this conversation too, because it's so important. Who is this conversation for when we're starting to think about energy deficit and the menstrual function?
Great question, because this certainly isn't just a conversation just for athletes. When we think about energy deficit, we're talking about energy output. So output through exercise, but also energy used for just activities of daily living. So your body requires energy to have your heart pump blood around your body and for your lungs to work. And so there's several ways that you can end up in an energy deficit, and it's not always through exercise. It's really like a simple math equation. If you're not eating enough caloric intake to cover your bases in terms of the energy output that your body's having on a daily basis, then you are in an energy deficit. And many people end up there unintentionally through dieting or perhaps even through disordered eating behavior.
Okay, I think that's such a good point, right? Talking about energy deficit, I think people in their mind will automatically go to one of those two options, right? Either that, I'm going to use the term loosely, over exercising, because I'm not sure that that's the right term, but exercising to the point of being in a deficit, or dieting to the point of being in a deficit. But it's quite often that people maybe are delving in both sides of that coin to get themselves into that overall energy deficit. And so even if you don't identify as someone who's dieting per se, or someone who exercises at an elite level, the math on that equation for you might still be putting you in this category of being in an energy deficit.
Absolutely. And this is certainly something I see in my office, and it's not to stereotype people, but there's many folks who are, for all good reasons, trying to eat a very healthy or quote unquote clean diet and are exercising a pretty reasonable amount, but they are ending up in an energy deficit unintentionally, just through being very stringent with their habits and maybe just being a little bit misinformed about, what their energy needs actually are for their level of activity.
So what actually happens? Can you just draw that picture for our listeners between, food and energy availability and the menstrual cycle? Because that may not even be a connection that listeners have made in the past. What is happening there exactly?
Absolutely. So really it stems from the hypothalamus, which is, as you mentioned, the term for losing your menstrual cycle from an energy deficit is hypothalamic amenorrhea, which means missing your period from a hypothalamus problem. So really what's happening there is the hypothalamus is actually a part of our brain that is both sensing external stimuli as well as internal state of the body. And really that gland is going to be sensing how much energy is available in the body, as well as how much stress there is on the system. And in response to those things, those stressors, both, what we think as typical stress, mental, emotional stress, but also physical stressors like not enough fuel coming in or a huge amount of energy output through exercise. And the hypothalamus is basically going to reroute energy distribution in the body. And when there's not enough energy to do all of the day-to-day physiological functions and sustain the amount of exercise that someone is doing, the hypothalamus is basically going to prioritize certain physiological functions over others. And really, we are wired for survival. And so when there's not enough energy to go around, the priority is going to be for functions that keep us alive, not so much functions that optimize our, or just help us thrive or help us reproduce. Those are not of importance when we're dealing with how do we survive this day? And so this is what our brain is doing. It's making these tough calls, these triages to decide where energy is distributed and where other things have to be shut down, like digestion or like the menstrual cycle. Both ovulation and menses are energy intensive processes, and they're not required for us to survive. Of course, they're important for the survival of our species, but if our brain is we really just got to make sure we make it through this day, our brain is going to make sure we shut down reproductive function because it's too energetically costly. And so what happens is there is a hormone that kind of initiates all of our reproductive function called GnRH. And when the hypothalamus is sensing, way too much stress or an energy deficit, it's going to reduce the secretion of GnRH, which then suppresses LH and FSH, which are another two brain-based hormones. And in response to suppressed LH and FSH, our ovaries no longer produce adequate estrogen and ovulation is shut down.
So it's kind of like, reproduction is not an essential service, right?
Exactly.
So if, the alarm bells are going, and I find this fascinating. One of the things I've loved looking at with respect to this is that not like everyone kind of has their own set point, right? And I think that's kind of an important piece to share, that your body's capacity for that load of exercise and nutrition and stress, right? It's called allostatic load, will differ than the woman beside you. So the way I've described it to patients in the past, I'm like, when you watch women at the Olympics, like some of them have their period and some of them don't. They all train within a minute of each other, or they all eat within fractions of each other. They're literally all doing the same thing. But not all of them have menstrual irregularities, right? That set point is different in each person, which is why, if you're looking at yourself and you have menstrual irregularities and you look at the cubicle beside you and you're like, yeah, but Julie eats way less than me, that doesn't equate, right? It's not this like, set in stone, if you don't do this much exercise, do not pass go, you do not get a period. It actually is an internal set point that even may change through your lifetime for what your capacity is to menstruate through stressors.
Absolutely. And this is something I experienced when I was running in university, because while it was relatively common for women on the team that I competed, we were all doing the exact same training, like down to the second. And of course, our nutrition varied, but it was about 50-50 who lost their period and who didn't. And it was really challenging to try to figure out, like, I'm doing the same training as her. Why am I having this issue? And she's just, thriving over there. I've tried to dive into the literature about why this is happening. And I think because it's such a sort of complicated calculation with respect to both your fuel intake, your output through exercise, also your output through just like daily living, and then also stressors, right? Mental, emotional stressors play into this as well. So if we're taking into account all of those factors, no one's going to have the exact same, picture as someone else. And the other piece is that we know that in younger women, they're more likely to experience menstrual cycle changes if they're in a low energy state, because that hormonal axis is still maturing. And they're also at a really sort of fragile time because they're accumulating bone mass and bone density. And one thing, I'm sure we'll talk about this, one of the consequences of having a missing menstrual cycle is that it means that your estrogen levels are so low that you're having some consequences on bone health. Estrogen is a hormone that really helps contribute to good bone density. And we know that peak bone mass occurs relatively early on in life. And so teens and adolescent women who are missing a menstrual cycle are missing those years of their life where they're still accumulating bone mass, and then their peak bone density is going to be lower, and they're going to continue to lose bone mass from a sort of a lower starting point, which is going to be something that will impact them lifelong after that experience.
So I'd love to dive in and talk a little bit about what to look for, because there, certainly that menstrual irregularity happens a bit on a spectrum. And I want to paint that picture of, that there's there's no like stereotypical look that we should be looking for. I think when we start this conversation, we kind of imagine the like, the tall, very lean kind of waif runner, where that's not the only people that are impacted by this phenomenon. And even I will share, like I had to cut weight for a lifting competition in September, and the jury's still out if I missed a period because I'm getting old, or if it's because of my dieting and strain of training plus dieting. But I missed a cycle, or I had a 6-week menstrual cycle in October. It's actually part of the reason I ended up getting an Oura ring, was to track my cycle more closely to figure out, is this perimenopause, or was this a hypothalamic event, essentially, where because I had to so severely diet down into my weight class, because I basically waited too long before I started making changes, which I learned my lesson. But I missed a cycle. But if you look at me, right, I'm like a thick 145-pound, weightlifter. I certainly don't meet the mold of what you would imagine someone losing their period from dieting. And yet, when I paired up stress and training and dieting and all of the things all together in the same pile, I missed a period.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point, is that there's no weight requirement to experience menstrual cycle challenges from this hypothalamic energy deficiency state. We used to talk about this thing called the female athlete triad, which did describe, menstrual cycle dysfunction and being underweight, often in female athletes. However, that term is now pretty outdated, and we've moved to a term called relative energy deficiency in sport, which you'll notice if you ever learn much about that term, it talks nothing about weight, because we now recognize that these energy deficiency states can occur in people of any body size. So that's really important for listeners to recognize that you don't have to be underweight, or you don't have to be anything specific in your body to experience these challenges. And that's something I'm really passionate about sharing, because I think many folks, think, oh, I can't have this problem because, I'm not lean enough, or I'm not small enough to experience this. But we know that even folks in larger bodies experience menstrual cycle changes when they're in an energy deficiency state. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And we know that the literature around this is changing, and like the general conversation around this is changing. Has it trickled down to your personal healthcare practitioner? I think that's where I want this message to meet the user, right? Rather than, that the healthcare provider has technically the information at their fingertips to acknowledge that, even disordered eating, we're changing the way we talk about this, because you can have the consequences of disordered eating even if you're in a larger body. And the same as this piece. And yet you'll still have healthcare practitioners that are making a decision or biased decision based on the shape of someone's body. So what are those things that we should be looking out for? Because certainly if women just like flat out miss a period, that's a very obvious sign that something is amiss. But what else should we be looking for to see that we're like kind of flirting with this energy deficit, or that we're heading down that path?
Yeah, great question. So the things to be looking out for, of course, if you totally miss a menstrual cycle or miss several menstrual cycle, that should be a really big red flag. But there can also be more subtle changes, things like irregular cycles. So like you mentioned, if you're normally someone whose cycle comes, relatively frequently on a 28-day basis, and you all of a sudden have a period that came at 6 weeks instead of 4 weeks, that's something you want to be paying attention to. A lot of the research uses basically 2 classifications. So amenorrhea, meaning no periods at all, versus oligomenorrhea, which basically means too few periods. So, for example, when researchers are studying people in this state, they're often classifying them as oligomenorrhea if they are having 6 cycles or less in a 12-month period. So that's a really good way to look at it in terms of an overall trend, right? If you're not having 6 or more cycles in a year, like that should be certainly a sign that something's amiss. And the other thing, the listener should take note of is, of course, we're talking about menstrual cycle irregularities that aren't explainable by something else. So if you've been diagnosed with PCOS, or perhaps you became pregnant, or you're perimenopausal or menopausal, those are other reasons that you might be experiencing menstrual cycle changes that make it less likely that we're seeing hypothalamic amenorrhea. But of course, just like the example Jordan shared, sometimes it's hard to tell which is which. And that's why it's important to really bring these changes up to your practitioner and have them help you figure that out.
And I've even noticed, like, in patients where they'll have a seasonal change in their menstrual cycle based on like their seasonal training. And again, that's, you may be gray and kind of fall between the lines there where, oh yeah, well, I never get a period between like May and October, right? But then this is like where you have high mileage, or there's something about your sport that has a seasonal component to it. So it's important for you, again, as that listener, to, know what your normal is, track what some of those, I guess they're abnormalities, but some of those variances are that are worth bringing up to your practitioner, because it's a little bit like detective work, trying to figure out the reason why a cycle has become irregular. The other one I'll point out, just because we have lots of moms of young women listening, is that delayed start of their first period. It can also be something to look at, especially in your young female athletes. And you'll get these like, kind of small for age young women that are moving through. My daughter's in gymnastics, and so I'm like incredibly sensitive to this sport, where, generally smaller bodies are attracted to the sport / sometimes encouraged in the sport. And we may see a delay of that very first period. And so it's hard to tell, because we don't know, are they just not going to get their period until they're 15 and that's normal for them? Or is this a consequence of some of that energy deficiency?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And a lot of the research, again, uses that cutoff of 15 years old. So if an adolescent woman hasn't had a first period by 15, then we're starting to consider whether or not they might be in this energy deficiency state. The other point that I really love that you touched on there, Jordan, is the fact that there are certain sports that really incentivize being at a lower weight, whether that's because of a energetic advantage. Like, for example, in running, the lighter you are, theoretically, the more efficient you are. And then the other sports that can certainly just provide a scenario that's higher risk to fall into this trap are things like gymnastics, figure skating, ballet, sports where there's more of like an aesthetic advantage, or sports like yours, like weightlifting, where there are weight classes and you have to meet those weight classes, and sometimes in a very short amount of time. So these are certainly, scenarios that will kind of lead to being in an energy deficit more likely than other sports.
So we started to touch on it there. Just the regularity of the cycle certainly is that big red flag. But I know there's other things we can look for, such as like the volume of blood loss and heavy periods, for those younger women, especially that, I'll work with young gymnasts who they have a period, but it's like horrifying for them because of how heavy it is. And it takes that like little bit of detective work to realize that they're probably anovulatory cycles that they're having, those young athletes. And for them, it's like a big flag because they're competing in a leotard, right? But for young women who also are experiencing just other menstrual symptoms or changes, we probably should be on high alert for this as well.
Absolutely. So as you touched on, just because you have a menstrual cycle doesn't mean that you are ovulating. And really, it's the ovulatory status that indicates whether or not someone's in an energy deficiency state. So for example, with patients who I suspect they're in a bit of an energy deficiency state, but they do have a menstrual cycle, the things that I'm looking for is, has their menstrual cycle changed from what has, typically been normal for them? So like you mentioned, heavier periods typically are telling us that there's an ovulation. Or I also look for lighter than average periods. I often see that before someone completely loses their period, they're having really, really light cycles, like just spotting, just requiring a panty liner. Like that is a sign that, especially if that's not normal for someone, that there has been a huge change there. The other thing I also teach a lot of my patients to assess for, especially if they're really keen to understand their own body and their own ovulatory status, is to look for signs of ovulation more so than just the signs of their period. And there are, body signs that we can look for, both body temperature as well as cervical mucus changes, that can help us determine whether or not someone is ovulating on a regular basis. And that can be even a better indicator of energy status than whether or not they're getting a period. So that's a huge piece of the puzzle. And I'm actually really stoked to see, I know several, fairly high level athletes who through their training environment are being taught to use LH strips. So those are strips that you urinate on to tell if you're having an LH spike that indicates ovulation. So that's really, really cool to see that a lot of teams are becoming very informed about how it's actually ovulatory status that is the most important indicator of being in an energy balance state. And that's certainly something that people can be taught to assess for themselves.
And what else should we be looking for? And you and I kind of mentioned we were before we hit record, right? There are others, some of those like special populations, maybe people who are on the pill, maybe people who've had a hysterectomy, right? Who are in their later reproductive years, but don't get that indicator quite as clearly. Maybe they have an IUD, something that's influencing that month-to-month feedback, right? What else are we looking for? I mean, we've talked about the impact of being in an energy deficit before on the podcast, but just thinking about that overall health experience of those people, what else can we be looking for that might signify that you're actually in an energy deficit?
Yeah, that's great. So the first point there, I just want to make sure was really clear, is that if you're on the pill or using other type of hormonal contraceptive doesn't mean that you can't be in this energy deficiency state. You could be getting, a really regular bleed on the pill and think, oh, I'm fine, but that's actually not the case. So the other things that we want to look for, if we've got some confounder like the pill or a hormonal IUD or a hysterectomy, are other signs of energy deficiency. And there are, of course, other symptoms that show up, such as being chronically fatigued or having really low performance or declines in performance. Having mood changes, of course, can be a challenge as well. But the other piece that's really important, I think, in our role as practitioners is to actually sit down with someone and assess what's going on with their energy balance. So having a really in-depth look at what their energy intake is actually like and comparing that with their exercise or just how active they are, and really determining whether or not they are likely, meeting their needs for fueling. And that's something that oftentimes when we actually sit down and detail that out, it becomes relatively clear, especially if you've got a keen eye as a practitioner, to figure out whether someone is actually meeting their needs or not.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. I know that the calculators on like how much you do need to fuel and how much you are burning, during your exercise, they're not 100% accurate, right? But they're also not, we don't need to throw them in the garbage either, right? Even if we ballpark and get reasonably close, again, a practitioner that has that sort of keen eye can see, that there's, ballpark this like 500 or 600 calorie deficit that's happening, the majority of the time. That's enough to put some people into a hypothalamic amenorrhea state, which, lots of people actually are trying to achieve that level of deficit to meet a weight loss goal, right? It's like, that is not that significant of a deficit in order to cause some menstrual cycle irregularities. The other thing I think is kind of important here is that you don't need to be losing weight in order for this to be showing up as an imbalance. I've worked with lots of women where they had basically these catch-up days where, en masse, they were not losing weight at all. But when we tracked their caloric intake across 7 or 14 days, 10, 11 days out of those 14 were in a really severe energy deficit. They caught up a few other days of the week. And so their net and weight loss was 0. And so in their mind, they were eating enough, right? But when we looked at each individual day, there were enough days they were under fueling that was influencing their brain's perception of how good things were, which was then influencing their ovulation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to go back on what you said with the 500 to 600 calorie deficit, some studies even indicate that it's a smaller gap. It's like 300 calories a day. If you're under eating by that much, you might be experiencing this. So this is really, it can get nitty gritty, and you could think, I'm doing really well. I eat 3 meals a day. I fuel appropriately, but depending on what your activity is like, you could just be missing about 300 calories a day and be experiencing this. So that's really important to note. It's not egregious often, it's subtle, which is why it's important to work with someone who can help you figure that out. But the other thing you touched on there, Jordan, that I really loved is, it's not just about overall, if we look at the big picture, are you meeting your needs? Most people are, especially if they're not noticing weight loss. But the other thing is, it's not just about whether or not you're meeting your caloric needs on a big scale. It could be, periods of time when you're in an energy deficiency state. So one thing that I work with a lot of people on is, even if, we determine they're eating the right amount of calories, where in their day are they eating them? Are they going long periods of time with no fuel? Are they exercising in a fasted state? That's a huge stressor on the energetic system. Or are they exercising and then not refueling for hours on hours? These are really common traps that, even if the amount of overall energy is correct, just where it's distributed in the day is a problem. Or the other thing I see quite commonly is that the amount of calories is appropriate, but the macronutrient distribution is problematic. So we see this frequently in endurance athletes, because since they are using such a carbohydrate predominant fuel source, but there is so much, diet culture, I'll just use that term, around low carbohydrate diets. If folks are, using a lot of carbohydrates through their exercise and then only refueling with fat and protein, that alone could be creating an energetic challenge for them that's going to result in some impact on their hormones.
It's funny, every time I see something like that get posted on Instagram or on social media, I just think about how miserable I would be, right? Someone's like, oh, fasted cardio. I'm like, oh, so miserable cardio. They're like,
Absolutely.
Here's my post-run keto fat bomb. And I'm like, oh, so you're miserable, right?
Yeah, and I certainly can talk from personal experience. There was a time in my life, through just total misinformation, that I was doing a fair amount of my training in a fasted state. And honestly, it was because I was a busy university student, and the only time I was going to get my run in was first thing in the morning. So, it's not always intentional. Sometimes it's totally accidental, but now I know better, and I feel so much better when I fuel even before that early morning run.
Mm-hmm. And it's common for people to not feel well, if they eat before they exercise, where I'm this great, lucky person that I could literally eat a steak dinner and then go to the gym and it'd be totally fine. So I understand that sometimes, but I also think if you're that person, probably could work with someone to have some creativity around what fueling can look like. It doesn't mean no food. It probably means different food in order to help support you so that you don't have to do that exercise in a fasted state. Yeah, I think that's what I always just, every time I see it, I'm like, oh, so you're miserable. There's
Totally.
no other
Super
way around that.
miserable.
You're
Yep.
so grumpy.
I remember stumbling through a lot of those runs, just feeling like garbage, and I don't feel that way anymore.
Mhm.
The other thing you mentioned there, yeah, like the fueling and digestive challenges around exercise, that's something that I chat with patients about a lot, because I do find it's a barrier to people fueling appropriately. When we think about, fueling around exercise and really wanting to have some food in your system when you're exercising, a lot of times people say, but if I have that too close to exercise, I'll feel uncomfortable, or I'll have digestive challenges. And that's something to certainly work with a registered dietitian around. I make a lot of referrals to sport specific RDs for that purpose. But the other thing is too, and I noticed this both through my own story and also with patients, and it is reported in the literature, is often that when there is some disordered eating behavior, there can be digestive challenges that result from that. And so starting to heal that relationship with food, starting to work on appropriate eating behaviors could be something that actually helps to resolve that digestive challenge and make it easier to fuel around exercise. And that was certainly my experience. That was definitely one of the reasons I wasn't fueling prior to my runs, was because I was worried about having an upset stomach. But now that I've learned so much more and, healed my relationship with food, I can eat almost like you, not a steak before my runs, but a lot of things before my runs and not have any problems.
Well, my next question, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit there, is like, where do people go from here? Like, how, I think we really, spend some time on thinking about that assessment piece, that it can look different in every person. Just because, Julie over here only eats salads and she has her period doesn't mean that you can only eat salads and you will keep yours, right? I think we need to recognize there's some big individual set point around what our bodies will tolerate and continue to ovulate. That it's not just about losing your period outright, right? Irregular cycles, heavier or lighter than normal cycles, might be pointing in that direction of an energy deficit. We alluded a little bit to some of those long-term consequences, especially around bone mass. That's maybe our biggest consequence. But how do we move forward from here, right? Like, what does healing look like? And if someone's lost their period, like what are our expectations of it returning when people start to get better, quote unquote, or start to have better math on their energy availability?
That's a great question. And I think it's super individualized. So it really depends on the patient's goals. Of course, there's long-term consequences of not having a period that we want to prevent, but it also depends on what that patient came in with. Are they really low energy? Do they have fertility goals? And right now they don't have a period, so they can't get pregnant. Have they noticed that their mood is really impacted? Or are they struggling with their relationship with food or body image? Those are kind of the common initiators I see. And depending on what actually brought that patient in, I start right there. Like if it's the body image piece, we'll start with some mindset work and starting to, just practice healthy eating habits. If it's the low energy piece, we want to start to resolve that energy deficit right away to see some improvements in energy. If it's the fertility piece, of course, again, we need to, it always comes down to resolving the energy deficit. That's always the first step, but often that comes along with healing, a history of poor relationship with food, or helping to improve body image or learn body neutrality. Often it comes with expanding someone's identity, especially if they are an athlete. They might be really, really tied to that identity as the fastest person in their training group, or the, leanest gymnast, what have you. We need to start to have that person realize that they are so much more than their sport, and help them to, expand their interests and create just a little bit less focus on exercise and nutrition. There also is sometimes a role for things like hormone therapy. And this is something that I'm really encouraged to see coming out in the research, that for folks who have had a really, really long period without a period, no pun intended, they might benefit from some bioidentical estrogen and progesterone. And this is something that in the research is showing to improve bone density, especially for those who've gone a long period of time without a menstrual cycle, as well as help to resolve some of the mental health challenges that might be occurring. In the research, it actually appears that folks who take bioidentical hormone therapy have an easier time resolving their energy deficit and returning to an appropriate weight at which they can start to have their own menstrual cycle without hormones again. So it really, really depends on where this person is and what their goals are. But there's, so many tools that we have to help folks like this.
Yeah, I love that, the research on some of the hormone therapy. It's interesting because I think some of these challenges can get into this vicious self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Especially if people have some of those tendencies around disordered relationship with food or body dysmorphia, that the lower their energy intake and availability, the more that puts pressure on their tendencies towards poor mental health, right? And that exacerbates, especially if their mental health is tied to a lot of their eating behavior, it really exacerbates that. There was a neat little pilot study that looked at giving estrogen, that the people that took estrogen, right, as part of, and progesterone, but the people who took estrogen as part of their recovery actually had better body acceptance than the patients who were not on hormone therapy. So they rated their ability to return to, a healthier body weight, et cetera. It was better than the control group, which is so fascinating, right? Because it's almost like if we can just spin in the other direction, right? Versus spinning towards less availability of energy, less fueling, more exercise, more mental health challenges, and less estrogen, which then probably puts pressure on all of those pieces. We can just spin the patient in the other direction, and not making it sound so easy. But if we start that ball rolling in that other direction, all of those components actually compound each other in a very positive way, versus things being compounded in a negative way. I find it really fascinating where that research is going.
Absolutely. So do I. And looking back at my own experience, I totally believe it, because I really found that when I was missing a menstrual cycle, I did have, mental health consequences. I had really bad insomnia. I was really, really rigid in my exercise and nutrition habits. And that was something that I just could not, get over, despite lack of trying, until I got my period back. It was really, really odd how all of a sudden one day, like, things just flipped. And once I was sort of back in that normal hormonal state, somehow that made it so much easier to continue the behavior changes that helped me get my cycle back. So, fueling better and, having a really more fluid and more healthy relationship with exercise. And it's something that, I continue to work on. And I think it's just absolutely amazing how much actually our hormones help us create a really better balance with exercise and food, and all the more reason to work on reestablishing that energy balance, because it then actually becomes way easier to maintain.
I so appreciate your sharing, Katrina, both your personal story, but also your level of expertise on this topic, right? I think that both practitioners and listeners alike can gain a lot from thinking about that menstrual irregularity and energy balance from this perspective. So I'm really grateful that we had the chance to share. I think our audience is going to really benefit from this conversation. Where can our listeners find you if they want to learn more from you?
Yeah, so I'm mainly on Instagram. My handle is at Dr. Katrina Allison _ND. I'm also just starting out a TikTok channel, seeing how that's going. So certainly find me over there. And then you can find out more about my services and how to work with me at drkatrinaallisonnd.com.
Wonderful. And we will put the links to all of those things in the show notes, so you can flip back over there if you're listening and follow along. Katrina supports people in British Columbia, in Canada. And so if you are in that neighborhood, which we have many, many listeners who live on the West Coast, make sure that you check out those links. Thank you so much for being here with me on this very early morning for you, given our time zone differences. Thanks so much, Katrina.
Thanks for having me. This was a blast.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. We're changing things in women's health. One episode, one topic, one conversation at a time. I want you to feel confident in your health. Please remember that the podcast does not constitute a medical relationship or medical advice. Please talk to your family doctor, your practitioner, your specialist, or anyone on your health team if you think some of the topics we discussed in today's episode apply to you. Take care of yourself. Until next time.